No compensation for the victims of North Carolina's forced sterilization program. We look at similar programs that were implemented across the United States. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. Tens of thousands were forcibly sterilized throughout the 20th century across the US. They were deemed, quote, feeble-minded and inappropriate candidates for reproduction. Most states abandoned the practice after World War II amidst revulsion at the Nazi program of eugenics. North Carolina, however, ramped up its use of forced sterilization. In all, more than 7,500 were sterilized in that state alone. It did halt its program in 1974, and last year it finally began taking steps to compensate those targeted. But on Thursday, the state Senate rejected the plan, arguing it was too expensive. Elaine Riddick was one of those forcibly sterilized in North Carolina when she was a young girl. Both she and her attorney, Willie Gary, say they're disappointed with the Senate's decision, but vow to continue the fight for reparation.
I was a victim of rape, and as a result of the rape, I became pregnant, had my son, went into the hospital, and I was sterilized. They sterilized me without my knowledge or consent.
I mean, there are various stages to this. First of all, in the pressure that your guardian, your grandmother at the time, was put under to have you taken into custody by a social worker. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did she, the authorities say that she gave her consent for you to be both taken into custody and sterilized?
Well, you have to remember my grandmother was coerced into signing an X for me to become sterilized, but she didn't understand what sterilization or tubal ligation was at that time. All she knew, I believe, is that her food supplements were being threatened to be taken away from her if she did not consent.
This whole program was set up and designed to get, to stop anybody, no matter what color you were, from having children or giving birth. If you, number one, came from a background of a crime, or if your mom or dad had been arrested, had been in jail, or if they were undesirables, or if mentally you had some illnesses or some handicaps that they did not want good red-blooded American people to have children. They wanted to weed out the undesirables and create a class that they thought was only desirable. And that's not the way it worked. You don't do that to anybody.
Elaine, when did you find out that you had been sterilized?
Well, I didn't find out until I was 19.
And what were the circumstances?
Well, I had gotten married at the age of 18, and my husband and I, we decided to wait at least a year before we decided to start our family. And we did just that, but in the process I kept getting sick, and we found out that I had been sterilized, and that was it.
The fight goes on, clearly. Are you going to continue your legal action or attempts at legal action against the state?
We don't want litigation. That's the last thing that we want, but we want to make it clear. That's what it takes. That's what it's going to be, because not only do I represent Elaine, but a number of other people, and the class is growing. I mean, you could be talking about billions of dollars that's in damages here. But, I think mediation is a good way to go, to sit down and try to talk through your differences, but it's not going to go away.
Elaine, I mean, you did attempt to sue the state once before. I think many people will find it pretty amazing that the jury decided that you were not unlawfully deprived of your right to bear children.
Well, first, you also have to look at the mentality of the jury and who they were. You have to remember that during the time that before it went to the Supreme Court, The people that was on the jury was none of my equal, none of my color, or none of my age. Okay, so they, of course, and all of them were from North Carolina.
So what were the origins of forced sterilization and how widespread was its use across the United States? To discuss this, we're joined by Stephen Selden, the author of Inheriting Shame, the story of eugenics and racism in America. Joining us from Atlanta, Paul Lombardo, a bioethics and legal scholar. And our third guest, John Raley, is the co-author of an investigative series titled Against Their Will. It was a special investigative report into North Carolina's sterilization program. And a side note here, many of the historical photos you'll see in this program are courtesy of the image archive from the American Eugenics Movement and the Southern Conference Education Fund. John Raley, then, first of all, what happened in North Carolina? There seemed to be quite a bit of support for some form of compensation from the governor and from the House, and yet we have this decision.
Yes, it's a black eye to North Carolina. What happened this week, Shihab? It's devastating. I mean, we had pushed this for 10 years. The victims, supporters, we had it all the way up the hill, and the House, under the Speaker of the House, Tom Tillis, had worked hard on it, set it up in his chamber. Overwhelming vote passed a few weeks ago. He had $10 million in his budget. The governor had $10 million in her proposed budget. And then the Senate, despite our pleas from our paper, all papers all across the state, victims were calling his office. He does virtually nothing with it. The state Senate did virtually nothing with it. They never seriously considered it, and when they came out with their budget compromise, the money was not there.
Here's one of the justifications for the decision from Republican State Senator Chris Carney. He said, "We all agree with the fact that an apology is certainly appropriate, but I don't think that makes us any more sorry because we attach a dollar figure to it." Is that the sort of argument that we were hearing then?
It is, and it's ludicrous. I mean, you know, in this country, money is the way we say we are sorry for what happened, and we're gonna make amends. I mean, we have lawsuits. We just had a soldier in Afghanistan, for whatever reason, kill a bunch of innocent civilians. They got $50,000 each within weeks.
Professor Lombardo, another reason was put forward, though. State Senator Austin Allran said, if you start compensating people who've been victimized by past history, I don't know where that would end. Was there some sort of fear then of wider reparation claims from other sections of society?
Well, I don't think there's ever a time when people will quit making claims for compensation, but this is relatively unique. You have a small group of people who have been identified. They don't go on forever. They're dying off pretty quickly, in fact. And in most states, they've already died. So I think worrying about how long this is going to stretch out is really just hypothetical.
I suppose what's so interesting is North Carolina was seen as really setting the standard on this issue because at least they were considering compensation. Other states haven't even offered an apology, really, have they?
Yes,
it's true. There are
Go ahead, Professor.
more than 30 states who had laws like this and did sterilize people, and only 7 of them have stepped up and even recognized that they did it, made some kind of apology, or at least said that what they did was wrong.
All right, Professor Selden, let's try and understand how this became so widespread as a policy. And I guess we have to then go to the late 19th century with the emerging, quote, science of eugenics, and then the early 20th century with the emerging science of genetics through Gregor Mendel. How does all this fuse to reach what we see in North Carolina?
So in the 18th century, Mendel's work on peas becomes known at 1900. Right. In the late 19th century in England, the eugenics movement begins. And it moves across the ocean to the United States, where it was positive in England, marrying best with best. In the U.S., we have positive and negative eugenics, marry best with best, and keep those who are judged to be inferior from reproducing. By the early 20th century, the American eugenics movement begins to operate, and it popularizes eugenics nationally in fairs, for ministers who give speeches on it.
So what are the intellectual justifications then for taking something, science that was basically about plants, frankly, and then sort of transposing that to humans then?
The proposition was that all human traits were much like the traits of peas, and so you simply had to remove those that were inferior. The science of that particular science was wrong, and by the early part of the 20th century, likely before the first decade, biologists knew it was wrong. but they didn't associate themselves with the eugenicists. So you had a separation between those who supported eugenics and the biologists who saw the eugenicists as not scientists at all.
And this really did catch on. I mean, it became enormously influential, almost part of what was the accepted scientific norm on American campuses, perhaps, and just, just a fact of life, that this is what you could do?
Yes, there were college courses on eugenics, and in the American high school textbooks of the period, eugenics was thought to be a legitimate science.
And was it always then imbued with racism?
Biological determinism, which is the argument that's being made here, we are determined by our biology, is the basis for racism. So races are different biologically, and therefore we can make judgments about those who are superior and inferior.
As it became then the norm, then the intellectual norm, it also received a great deal of funding from the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Harrimans and these major families in the U.S. What were they? I mean, Professor Lombardo, I mean, they were funding these handsomely funded institutes then around the U.S. who were collecting records, genetic records on people and so forth. What were those records being collected for, with a view to doing what exactly?
Well, the desire of the funding sources was for people to be able to understand how heredity worked. Heredity then, as now, is something that people get very excited about. If the idea that was accepted in an era when most people in America lived on farms was that like produces like, if you have a prize steer and a prize bull, you put them together and you get prize calves. This idea was generally accepted, and the people who were putting the funding forth felt like studying how this concept worked in human beings was a good idea. To be able to understand how we could breed for the best was something they thought was worth putting their money into. How
did it make the leap then, Professor, from academia and the wealthy classes into the legislative framework of America? In 1907 already then, you have Indiana putting in legislation based on eugenics. How does that shift take place?
The earliest proposals are actually in the North. Michigan in the 1890s proposes a law to sterilize criminals. It doesn't pass. Pennsylvania actually passes a law in 1905, but it's vetoed by the governor. States like New York and Massachusetts also had laws that were eventually passed, and they did some sterilization in those places. But the focal point tended to be institutions, places that people spent money to build, places that were relatively new in the 19th century, but by the early 20th century were becoming full of people who were in need of social services. Maybe criminals, maybe people in mental hospitals, maybe children in places called homes for the feeble-minded or the epileptic. Those are expensive places, and both the people who worked there, the doctors, as well as legislators, were looking for a solution to not let them grow any bigger than they were. So passing a law that would prevent people from having more children was one way.
Professor Selden, though, I mean, we can't ignore, though, the racial undertones of all this. So I mean, there is this prejudice then against those who are, quote, impaired in some way, but then what about the racial motivation behind all this?
From early on, eugenicists would look at Eastern and Southern Europeans coming into the United States and look at them askance, and so there was always a sense that the other, in this case, those that weren't like the dominant group in society, were somehow a threat, and the threats were thought to be both external and internal. External from those immigrants who would come and bring their bad heredity, if you will, and internal threats as well, which leads us, I think, to a degree to North Carolina, where the threats are from indigenous populations, if you will.
And John Rayleigh, then, North Carolina, the example we had of Elaine Riddick, who we were just speaking to a bit earlier, then, as this legislation is put into practice, is her experience in 1968 pretty much as it was in the early part of the 20th century, that people were, I mean, she was raped. A social worker, theoretically, who was supposed to help the victim, pressures her guardian to get her sterilized. A psychological evaluation takes place. She's found to have an above average IQ, and yet a board is convened. How does all this work then?
Look, by the 1960s, when this happened to Elaine, and Elaine and I have talked a lot about this over the years, it was a sham, and her case, unfortunately, is not that abnormal. I mean, it's not that unusual. This was going on in case after case. The social workers are bullying these people into these operations, and it's a monster hiding in plain sight. that they're putting out these cheery press releases. They're sterilizing their very story, this program. They're telling people, oh, we're saving these people from parenthood, they would say, stuff like that. Nobody knew just how aggressive the social workers were. And it starts off, I would argue, that yes, in the end, it's a form of genocide against African Americans. But in the beginning, it's all about socioeconomics, as so many things are in the American South.
But even in Elaine Riddick's case, it seems, when she was discovered to have an above-average IQ, her lack of means, the poverty that she was living in, was taken into account as a factor of her feeble-mindedness.
Sure, this program was always about two things going on. There was part of the national eugenics movement about improving bloodlines, and the other half was about saving the government money. There are conversations in our legislature on record back in the day where they're talking about that.
There was some resistance, clearly, because in 1927, the Buck versus Bell case reached the justices. The Supreme Court ruling actually was quoted at the Nuremberg trials by the Nazis, actually, in their defense, the ruling. It's never been expressly overturned, but the Supreme Court found in favor of eugenics, and this is a portion of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes's finding, quote, "It's better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Professor Lombardo, I mean, so the Supreme Court actually in some ways strengthened the hold of eugenics over the US as it continued. I mean, and that's the point. I mean, this practice did continue up until the 80s in Oregon, for example. I mean, it's astonishing.
Well, it's true that the Supreme Court decision really clarified the endorsement of eugenics in America. There was a fair amount of disagreement. People writing articles and letters to the editor and making speeches, people like Clarence Darrow and others condemning sterilization, and many scientists as well. But when the Supreme Court spoke, most of that opposition seemed to melt away, and programs were launched in the majority of American states. The last law was passed here in Georgia in 1937, and most of those states continued sterilizing people right up into the 1950s. The World War interrupted it. Most of the doctors were away serving, and so there was a change at that point. But as you have already said, places like North Carolina continued. The last sterilization record I was able to find in Virginia, where Carrie Buck was sterilized, was 1979.
Professor Stephen Selden, we mentioned the war there, and that's another part of this history that is perhaps willfully ignored, is how some of those in Germany in the 30s found some of the intellectual roots for their eugenics movement in the United States then.
They did indeed. And many of the leaders of American eugenics received awards and recommendations, commendations from their colleagues across the way who thought that the program in the United States was a model. It's interesting when we think about what we can do, what we can learn from that particular history moving forward. North Carolina has a wonderful opportunity to be a leader in terms of educating the children of North Carolina, in fact the children of the United States, about the history of the eugenics movement, and I think to speak to questions of human rights around that. And
we'll get to that in a second, but very quickly, Professor Lombardo there, if after the Second World War eugenics is declared a crime against humanity, how legally are North Carolina and other states in the U.S. able to carry on with forced sterilization?
Well, eugenics was never declared a crime against humanity. The kind of things the Nazis were doing in the labor camps and in the concentration camps involved torture. It involved x-raying people until they died in some cases. It involved injecting them with strange chemicals. That was considered science, that is the defense that the Nazis used.
Right, but Nuremberg, I suppose, I mean, there was a finding against trying to stop the bloodline of a particular grouping, for example.
It's one definition of genocide.
Right.
That was, as you say, that was a definition of genocide, but there was no specific finding against eugenics in any broad sense. And in fact, no one said after the Second World War that any of the laws in America should be struck down. At the time, there were 28 or so that were still in place.
And in fact, actually, in 1945, one U.S. representative proposed sterilizing Japanese Americans who were in internment camps. And I mean, that's the other point.
Those proposals were common.
Yeah. And in fact, there is evidence that in those internment camps, Japanese Americans were indeed sterilized. As we look back then on the history, I mean, do we have a proper record of how many people were sterilized, the age range. I mean, again, in North Carolina, a 10-year-old boy was castrated, actually. The racial makeup and so forth. Yeah.
You're talking about a program that began, as you said, in 1907 and extends all the way up to 1980. So the conditions are different in different states and in different times. The people running the program, doing the operations, running the bureaucracy are different, and the quality of the records are different too. Some states have very clear records, other states have terrible records or have lost them altogether.
And on that issue of the racial figures there, I mean, Professor Selden, it's interesting because initially in the first part of the 20th century it was mainly whites and, who were sterilized, but then there's a switch in the 60s, certainly in North Carolina, to African Americans.
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, what are we to make of that?
The definition of Nordic versus Mediterranean versus Eastern European were pretty close to racial categorizations even early on. So that again, the racial trope was very clear early in the beginning.
And in the 70s we have cases again, I mean, the Native American women, there was a sort of federal program almost to sterilize Native American
I mean, for those of us who study this, the surprise was that there were so few African Americans that we knew of early on, and that it became so clearly a focus upon African American women in North Carolina at the end.
Look, I call it the 3 Ps, at least in North Carolina. In the beginning, it's progressives, then it goes to paternalism, then it's rank prejudice at the end.
When does the tide turn, though? When does it become unacceptable? And why suddenly, then, do we see states and indeed academia perhaps turn against this and perhaps not even want to mention it again? Professor?
There starts to be litigation.
Yeah, go ahead first.
In the 1970s, there are some fairly significant lawsuits, and this hits the newspapers. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which is now HHS, Health and Human Services, quits paying for sterilizations unless a very elaborate procedure is followed to get consent. And that combined with the fact that most of the institutions were changing their leadership from people who were physicians and were comfortable with surgery to people who were psychologists and couldn't do surgery legally, that was the beginning of the end for the widespread movement within institutions.
And Professor Selden, you alluded to this perhaps, but has there been any reckoning with this legacy? Is there any sort of truth and reconciliation about what was going on so recently, or is this all just being swept under the carpet?
There are a number of organizations, such as the Eugenics Archive, that's keeping a record of that. And we have some historical analysis of the ways in which textbooks transformed the meaning of eugenics. Again, remember, it was positive and negative early on. The negative eugenics in the textbook in the early 20th century gets transformed to a kind of benign eugenics in which it's sort of marry best with best, and then begins to disappear from the textbooks by the 1960s. So we see in the textbooks a reflection of what's going on in the courts.
But Professor Selden, I mean, now genetic engineering is so advanced there.
Right.
I mean, can we now say, okay, well, this is all, everything we've been discussing is a symptom of the bad old days. We are now enlightened. Or as we map the human genome and we get so advanced, are there concerns still that genetic engineering will always be open to this sort of abuse?
Well, I think that the answer is, I think, in the affirmative. The question is, will it be negative eugenics going forward or a kind of positive neo-eugenics going forward? And we want to be careful to distinguish between medical interventions and enhancements. So if someone wants to have a taller child and you could introduce a piece of code that makes the child taller, that's one kind of an enhancement which we might not particularly like. Blue eyes, we might not find to be worthwhile. So it will raise the same kind of important ethical issues moving forward, more likely to be a kind of positive neo-eugenics in the future.
Professor Lombard, I mean, there is the legislation in the US theoretically that protects against this sort of thing from happening, but are you satisfied by that? And what about the rest of the world for that matter?
Well, I think that you have to make a couple of distinctions. It's clear that people can make choices, medical choices today, and even though those choices may be controversial, and not everyone would agree with them, it still is a case that those are not things decided by the government. The one thing we need to remember about the eugenics movement in America was that it was 30-odd states that had laws that would allow people or mandate that people be sterilized. It was laws to separate people and say they couldn't get married because they were of different races. And it was a law that prohibited people from southern and eastern European areas to come to America at all after 1924. Those laws were in place. All three of those kinds of laws were in place for more than 50 years. So we talk about eugenics in the future, we need to be aware of the thing we're talking about in the past, and that is a government-mandated scheme of reproduction or exclusion.
John Rayleigh, then, I mean, in summing up, I mean, your thoughts. I mean, at least North Carolina is reminding people of this dark history at the very least.
Yes, and as my friend Edwin Black of Oregon Against the Weak, and we often talk about this, that, you know, education, as y'all mentioned too, is key to it. That, you know, compensation is still very important, but so is education. The old, you know, it's become a cliche, but, you know, you've got to learn from this history. Look, we don't know what our government's doing now. I mean, I lived in North Carolina my whole life, and until I came on this in 2002, I had no idea. I was shocked to know this was going on in my state, Terry Sanford's North Carolina.
John Rayleigh, thank you very much. Professor Stephen Selden, thank you. Professor Paul Lombardo, thank you very much too.
Thank you.
That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.